What we're going to talk about today is SO2R, which stands for Single Op 2 Radio. It's something I've been doing for a long time. Not just give you some insight into kind of what's involved and how it works, that type of thing. This is a presentation that I've given at Contest University in Dayton this year, and I just modified it a little bit. So what is this SO2R thing that we talk about? We always say these acronyms like everybody knows what that means. Single operator is pretty obvious, one human doing all the operating, but they have two radios. And the rules are pretty clear. You can only transmit one signal at a time. So if there's any tension in this whole thing, it's how to organize it so that you're only transmitting one signal at a time, but you can switch back and forth between two bands. And this is something that people have been doing for quite a long time. Just to give you some example, the first time I started doing SO2R was in 1980, which was, gosh, I can't even think of how long ago that was. But notice that, a couple of C lines and pencil and paper and a keyer. A few years later, I was at a bigger station and we actually got to where we had three radios, although I could still really only handle two of them at a time because I only have two ears. Then I moved to Pittsburgh and notice something new that shows up in this picture, and that's a computer. It wasn't quite integrated into the station, but it's getting there. And then a few years later, moved to Boston, and here's the station there. And I'll show you a picture of what it looks like now in a few slides. But it's the concept's always still the same: two radios, some way to log, and we'll dig into some of the details on that now. So why do people do this SO2R thing? What's really what's driving interest in this and making people go crazy listening to audio from two radios all weekend? I think the main thing is it improves your productivity. There's so much time in radio contests where you're just waiting. You're waiting for somebody to send their call. You're waiting for somebody to work someone. You're waiting for somebody to repeat something. You're waiting for somebody because they're calling a really long CQ. Or you're waiting because you're transmitting, you're calling CQ, something like that. So there's just a lot of dead time that you can use. Also, if you're working people on one band and you can listen on another one, you can make better decisions because you can say, oh, like if I'm on 15, is 10 meters open? Or if I'm on 15, I'm still working a few stragglers, maybe 20 would be better. Let me go listen there, that kind of thing. It does reduce the boredom some because obviously you're more engaged in the contest. You don't have any dead time. And it does make it more fun, mostly because it makes your score better. And it's really become a kind of competitive necessity for guys in the top 10 of the DX contests and the sweepstakes to be pushing it to improve productivity and so on as much as they can. But in the end, it enables better use of time. The idea that you can use transmitting time to listen and line up QSOs on another band is really what it's all about. And if you think about it, there's a lot of transmitting time if you're trying to run people, even at 60 QSOs an hour, which is, not slow and not fast. You still are probably calling CQ a couple of times a minute, and each one of those is taking 4 to 10 seconds, depending on whether it's phone or CW. So think about that. That's just a lot of time where you got nothing to do but listen to your radio sending. So the fact that you can listen on another band and use that to try to find more contacts or new multipliers or whatever is huge. So one of the things that in radio contests, if you want to win, winning requires not working just the guys that are in the contest. If we just work the guys that were in the contest, we'd all be done after about 12 hours. Winning really requires working the most guys who aren't in the contest. So these are the people who just turn their radio on and they tune around, they call a few of the loud guys, and then they, have to go out and mow the yard or whatever. And also, you want to work as many multipliers as possible. And the common multipliers are just that. They're common. They're relatively easy to find, or they're expeditions. The thing is, you want that one guy on an island who turned his radio on for an hour, tune across to see if the band's open. You want him to call you. And that means you've got to be calling CQ all the time. So ABC, always be CQing. And that's why it seems like when you tune across the bands in a contest, there are all these stations that are just constantly calling CQ, because it's a little bit like fishing. You got to put the lure in the water and just wait until somebody comes back to you. At the same time, you can't just call CQ all weekend, because then you don't work all the other guys who are also calling CQ. So the mix here is I want to try to be able to do both. And that's what SO2R really does for us. I can be CQing all the time on maybe the best band, or perhaps not even the best band. I'm off fishing in some place where maybe a rare guy will call me. But I'm not completely wasting time, because I'm using the other radio to tune around on a busier band where I can work people. And it's not unusual sometimes to find that you can actually work more people by calling guys than you can by calling CQ. So there's a relatively new acronym that you've probably heard over the last 3 or 4 years called 2BSIQ. It's probably the worst name of all time, but it stands for two band synchronized interleaved QSOs. That's what CT1BOH called it. He's a financial analyst, I think, so I'm not sure. Definitely not a marketing guy. But with SO2R, we talk about the idea of we've got two radios, and oftentimes we're transmitting on one and we're listening on the other one. And it's kind of the idea that we're CQing on one and listening around on the other one. That's SO2R. Somebody got the idea that with this 2BSIQ concept, I can take all that same infrastructure, and now what I'm going to do is call CQ on one place while I listen on the other. And then when it flips over, I'm CQing on the place I was listening, and now I'm listening on the other one. So you really have two runs going at the same time. And if you're skilled enough at it, especially on CW, you can actually keep two pileups going at the same time. And KL9A, Chris is one of the best guys at this in the world. Another one is N6MJ. And W2SC at 8P5A. There's a bunch, I shouldn't say a bunch. There is a handful of guys who are at the right place in the world, who have a station where they can usually have 2 or 3 bands open to the population centers, and where they're both running at the same time. And what's really incredible about this is they can make CW rates close to 400 an hour. Because they're essentially doing 200 hours at the same time. And when you listen to this, it is just mind-blowing. I can't do it. I'm too old. But these young guys spend time practicing and really get skilled at this. But so I'm going to talk about SO2R because it's attainable by most of us in some form or another. 2BSIQ is where the mutant class has evolved to. So in a contest, how much is it worth to add a second radio? And admittedly, everybody's results are going to be different on this, but this is kind of at the top of the USA level in a CQ Worldwide CW contest. Here's my breakdown from 2000. And I did I did operate in all 48 hours. And the red at the bottom here is the QSOs that were made on the second radio. So it's not a huge number, but it's some. You're always sneaking some in. You're sitting there CQing, nobody answers you. Oh, let me throw my call in this other pile up on the other band. The guy comes back to me. I work him, I move on. And so almost every hour of the contest, except for a couple of them, I was finding QSOs on the second radio. And the result was another 550 contacts is what I counted up in this event. And that increased my score by more than 12%. Now, I may have worked some of those guys eventually anyway, but the fact was it's an extra 500 QSOs, and you only have so much time, so the faster you can work them, the better. I did the same calculations on a contest a year ago where I was single op assisted. So it's a little different assisted. You get a lot of help. You don't have to wait so much because the cluster is always telling you who people are, or at least telling you who they think people are. But again, it was worth about 700 extra QSOs, a lot of extra multipliers, because with spotting now, I can know exactly where to go, exactly where to listen. And my score improvement was about 15%. So I think that's a reasonable goal. And 15% on a 10 million point score is 1.5 million. So it's real money. So SO2R does help if you have a few things going on. Number one, you need the station to be well designed for this. Everything's got to be in front of you where it's easy to reach. You've got to have some automatic or some computer aided switching. So you're not having to throw switches or anything. The computer's kind of doing some of the audio flipping back and forth, that kind of thing. It's often easier on CW because a lot of CW contesting is pretty much pushing function keys and letting the computer do the sending. SO2R is really great at lower QSO rates because now you have a lot more dead time. You might have a lot more unanswered CQs. And so if you're only doing 60 QSOs an hour and you can go work another 20 guys on the other radio, that suddenly makes it an 80 hour. And that's a 30% increase in the number of contacts that you have. And so a lot of times the guys that are on low power QRP can really take advantage of this because they have even more waiting time. They often aren't getting as many answers to CQs, but by using two radios, they can always be CQing, even QRP, while they're tuning around and calling people. And of course, if you're QRP, you often get to spend a lot of time waiting while they work somebody else ahead of you. And so you can use that time to tune around. So maybe you're calling in two pileups at the same time, and whichever one you get through first, put that guy in the log and go find another one. It's probably the hardest to do when you have really high noise situations. So by this, I mean a lot of QRN because you're on 160 or 80, where you really need to focus your whole brain on copying the people you're trying to work. So often we'll not do SO2R then. Even if I've got a band that's open, like 40 or 20, once I go down to the low bands, you pretty much have to focus because it's more important to work guys because you need the multipliers than it is to try to grind out a few extra QSOs. And then also, if you're not able to hold a good run frequency, it can be really frustrating because you're constantly getting pushed around or having to go find another spot, which, but anyway, most of the time it's worth it. And of course, the louder you are, the better, like all things in contesting. So, how do you do SO2R? Well, it's pretty simple. I hope I've got this across by now. You take one radio, you find a clear frequency, and you start calling CQ. And then while that transmitting is going on, you have your audio split so you can go listen on the other radio and you start tuning around. And in the, you might use this tuning around time to look for multipliers. Just a lot of times I'll just work anybody that I can find on the second radio. I'm not particular. I want as many guys in the log as I can, but you might use the second radio just to tune around and check for band openings. So the second radio doesn't have to be a complete KW station with stacked monobanders or anything. It could be fairly simple. The goal is just to start using some of that dead time more efficiently. So what does it sound like? And I wish I had a good recording. I just never have gone and dug one out. There's plenty of recordings of my contest operations on my website, by the way, if you ever want to hear what 180 hour or something sounds like. So one way to do it is you listen to one radio at a time in both ears. So in this case, I'm just switching back and forth between radio A and radio B. I can only hear one radio at a time, but that radio is into both ears. Another way is I put one radio on each ear. So left radio is on my left ear, the right radio is on my right ear. Now I'm listening to two things at the same time. I don't think you really ever get to where you can copy both streams at the same time. You get pretty good at switching back and forth mentally just because you know what's going on. Oh, this guy's about to send his call sign and you need to go pay attention over here on the left one. Oh, he's about to send his call sign on the right. I better go listen on the right one. So I do quite a bit of operating with one radio going in each ear, but usually if I'm trying to copy somebody that I'm working, I will switch it so I only hear one radio. The other thing some people do is they set it up so that anytime they're transmitting, it switches both ears to the off radio, to the one that's the listening radio. And if you have the computer do all this, it's seamless. You don't have to touch anything. You just hit the CQ button or you're working a guy. Anytime you're transmitting, the radio is flipped over to the second radio. I find that very disorienting because I'd like to have a little more control. I like to know what I'm listening to, just habit from how I learned it in the very beginning. But a lot of people really like the automated thing. So now you can, while you're transmitting, you know what you're sending, the computer's doing it, so you can put all of your attention on the second radio. And then the other choice is to kind of do a combination of this. So what I've done in my station is I have one key on the keyboard. It happens to be the tilde key, it's the one in the upper left corner. And I have that set up to split my audio or unsplit it. So a lot of times I'll hit the tilde while I'm CQing, I hit the tilde, and now I'm kind of hearing the transmit audio, which some people don't like, but I like to hear the transmitting stuff going on at a low level while I'm tuning around in the other one. And then if somebody calls me, I hit the tilde button again, and now I'm back on the transmit radio for listening. And I'll just throw in a contest. I'll probably hit the tilde button 1,000 times over the course of a weekend where I split and unsplit and so on. And one reason I do that is because it never fails that you're getting ready to the guy that you're working is finishing, and it's your turn to transmit just about the time the DX station you're listening to decides to send their call. So by being able to stay split, even when you're transmitting, lets you maybe get a call sign instead of having the audio switch away or change modes on you, that kind of thing. So I like to do everything manually, but that's your choices. One radio in both ears, or one radio in each ear, or some combination. So if you wanted to do SO2R, what do you have to do? Well, step one, add a second radio to your station. So as I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be super complicated. The second radio doesn't need to be top of the line or anything. A lot of people, especially in a contest like sweepstakes, they'll just have a single band, maybe a 40-meter dipole or a 70, 80-meter dipole, and that's the second radio. And that way now they at least have some period of the contest where they can kind of get this productivity gain by working two bands at the same time. And all you really need is a way to switch the key or the microphone back and forth and the receive audio back and forth. So it's not really that complicated. And the only rule here is that make sure you can't transmit on both radios at the same time. And then the last thing, this is a word of caution. If you do two radios, you need to make sure that you protected the receiver front end, or that you have the antennas far enough apart that you're not going to blow out the receiver. I went to Austria to do an ARL DX contest, and I was guest operating, and we had two radios set up and did something stupid where we blew up one of them because we transmitted at the wrong time, and it just took out the front end of the second radio. So I did the contest with just one. So it's very easy to mess things up here. So you want to spend some time before you start doing this to either put in some bandpass filters or coax stubs, or just start with transmitting in low power and making sure that things are not overloaded. So this brings us to the real challenge of SO2R, which is I need a station where I can hear perfectly, or as well as I can, while I'm transmitting at the same time. And sometimes it's easier than others. Obviously, for example, if you're CQing on 7010, your first harmonic is 14020. Well, there's probably going to be a really loud signal on 14020 from your harmonic. So the question really becomes, how close can I get to that harmonic and still be able to hear? And you just want to work to try to make that as clean as possible. And the more you can hear while you're transmitting, the better this is going to be, both in terms of less mental fatigue, but also just more ability to tune the bands. And a big part of this, just to keep you from going crazy or getting worn out, is that the switching is as efficient as possible. I'll talk some more about that as we go along. And then, of course, I shouldn't say lastly, but you got to have the skills to be able to do it. It's a little bit like playing the piano and singing at the same time, or playing the piano where one hand is playing part of the melody and the other hand is playing the bass. You just have to get to where your brain kind of separates the functions, and you're not having to think about it. So I've kind of touched on this already, but antennas, keep them as far apart as possible. You do get a little bit of help if you use monobanders instead of tribanders, just because they tend to do a little bit better rejection. But any kind of bandpass filters that you can put in there to knock stuff down. On my station, I have bandpass filters and coax stubs to try to help with that. From a switching standpoint, I've already mentioned, it's not magic here. We're switching the keyer and the microphone, and we're switching the audio back and forth. It's that simple. Then the other thing you need to deal with is be able to switch feed lines and the bandpass filters and coax stubs and all this kind of stuff. It made my station become much easier to deal with this when I had one coax coming from every band. But most of the time you don't have that luxury. You end up with a tri-bander and a dipole or a fan dipole or something, and you are very limited in kind of what combinations that you can have. But that's okay. You can still take advantage of all of this. So my first SO2R controller, I built one weekend before a contest. I went to Radio Shack. I bought a box and some switches and those RCA connectors. And this box had been cannibalized by the time I took these pictures. But the idea was I had one switch that switched the left headphone back and forth and one that switched the right headphone back and forth. And I had another one that switched the keyer back and forth. That was my SO2R box. And so I was doing everything manually, and it worked surprisingly well. This was in the days when we were still doing computer logging. I mean, no, sorry, we're still doing pencil and paper logging. So I didn't have a computer in the way or a computer to help me. It was just like, okay, one hand on the box and the other hand on the pencil and the keyer. Nowadays, there's all kinds of SO2R controllers that you can buy at all different price levels. Really from, you know, used ones that you can easily find for less than $100 to ones that cost nearly $1,000. And some of these have stopped being made, but they're still quite available on the market. I tried doing all this stuff myself, and after a while, just finally realized it was a big waste of time. Get a box that does everything. I use the MK2R, this one at the top up here, because it lets me with one box do CW, do sideband, and also do RTTY and FT8 SO2R stuff, because it's got built-in sound cards and does all the switching and everything. But it tends to be a little pricey and a little complex to set up, but been absolutely fantastic and letting me have one setup, do everything. Which brings us to computers and software. They're pretty important. I'm going to start with software on the right side first. All the major logging software packages support SO2R. Some of them more than others, but I mean, they all are quite fine. They'll do everything that you need to do. DXlog is one that's coming on quite a bit. It's free, and they've done a lot of work with allowing you to build macros and so on into the software so that it can do all the switching and everything. And so it's something that both KL9A and N6MJ and N2NT all use that, because that's works really well for them. But any of the packages will do it. And you really kind of have a choice here. The key thing is you end up with two logging windows. You've got one for radio A, one for radio B, because sometimes you'll get in a position where you're logging a guy on one radio, or you actually end up with QSOs on two radios going at the same time. And you kind of need to be able to jump back and forth and enter stuff as it's being sent. So you it really helps to have two logging windows. And then, of course, the software is going to drive everything else in the station. So it drives your SO2R controller, which controls all the radio bits, and it gets the frequency. The SO2R box gets the frequency from the software. So here's a common question that comes up. Should can you do this with one keyboard, or do you need two? So for years and years, and even now, I still just use one computer and one keyboard. And then I rely on my keyboarding skills to be able to jump back and forth between the two radios. And it's not really that hard once you've practiced it enough times. And practice is going to be a key thing here. You have to get to the point where you're just, without even really thinking, you know how to get to the right radio and push the right button. But the guys that are doing 2B SIQ, where they're trying to run people on two bands, they've really leaned towards using two keyboards, so that it's almost a deal where they're moving back and forth between the two keyboards. And this just gives them a little more orientation as to which radio they're working with, and also lets them deal with fixing mistakes or trying to unwind problems if they get a call wrong or something like that, because the two radios or the two computer setups or keyboards are completely independent. I would just start with one if you're starting out on this. So here's an example of what my station looks like. I have a couple of K3s. I have Ham Plus antenna switch behind the amplifiers. I have two amplifiers, and then bandpass filters. And the bandpass filters get switched by as the radio changes bands, the BPFs change. I do not have the antenna switch automatically, partly because I'm cheap and don't want to pay for the automation, and partly because I like having, again, knowing what's going on. Although as you get tireder, you kind of wish that everything just automatically happened. And now with solid state amplifiers, you really want things to be automatic. But I still have tune amplifiers, so I figure if I'm changing bands, I have time to go put a switch. But this is kind of the key to anything. Two radios, two amplifiers, some type of bandpass filtering or protection, and then an antenna switch that can take either radio to any antenna. So this is what my station looks like today. I've gone to an L-shaped desk, and so the computer monitor is square in the middle. I still have to look at the keyboard when I'm operating, so I like the keyboard and the monitor to be as close to each other as possible, so I'm not my head isn't having to change a lot as I enter things. And the two radios are both easy to reach. In my case, both radios are the same, which is nice, but it's not required. Lots of guys use two different radios. It's whatever they have. The key thing here is with the L-shaped table, I can, I start pushing the things I need to see and reach a lot are near the center. And the things that I don't need to touch all the time, like the amplifiers, get pushed out towards the edge. In my particular case, I made a very conscious decision. Rotor boxes are on the left. I'm a right-handed person. I send right-handed. So if I'm doing CW, I want to be able to, while I'm calling the guy, I want to be able to reach up and turn the antenna. But I don't want to be switching antennas while I'm transmitting. And so by putting these antenna switches on the right, I'm less likely to reach over with my left hand. It's more like I'll quit sending and then reach up and change an antenna. So small thing. But that's my basic setup now. So you can see from the earlier pictures, it's come a long way, but it's still not as fully automated as some of these guys are. I talked about this a little bit already. SO2R to me is almost required if you're going to do low power QRP because you just have so much more time. You can get by with less filtering, less antenna separation, simpler antennas, but you can really make a huge difference in your score just because you're using all that dead time more efficiently. But, so I just have this one warning. It's probably not a good idea to try doing SO2R using two radios until you're really good at doing one. Because it's very easy to sound like a lid in this or to start making mistakes or busting calls, or you can actually cost yourself more points than you gain if you don't have some skills before you get into it. So how do you know when you're ready? How do you know when you've got to the point with one radio? It really comes down to if you're operating one radio and you're bored and you're thinking, well, I want to watch TV, like I almost always have a TV on when I'm operating just to either watch the Weather Channel or whatever sport is on. It's amazing what ESPN plays in the middle of the night for old sports events. So you can watch TV, or if you're reading a book or you're reading a magazine, or especially these days, if you find yourself looking at your phone all the time or playing Words with Friends, it's like, okay, you have spare capacity. You have spare brain capacity. It's time to start thinking about making the move. And it will take a little bit of time to learn. And a good example is driving a car. I've just watched my daughter go through this process of learning how to drive. When you start, it takes everything you've got to just think about driving. Am I in the middle of the road? It's almost hard to even, oh, is that really a stop sign? Oh, is this light going to change? What is this other car doing? Why is this guy following me? Oh, I need to turn. Where should I start putting my turn signal on? Think about all that stuff. It was so hard. And after you've done it for a while, you don't even think about it because all of that mechanics of driving gets pushed down into your subconscious. And so now you're talking to somebody else in the car. You might have something on the speakerphone. You might be eating a hamburger while you're driving. I'm not recommending this, but you can do all these other things at the same time. And yet the mechanics are still happening. You're still checking the mirrors. You're still looking out. You're still anticipating what's going to happen in front of you, that kind of thing. So I would say SO2R is very much the same, or like I said, playing a musical instrument, you have to practice. And practicing comes by doing. And that means you get everything set up, and then you just start working on how am I going to, building up the skills to do this. So one of the things that helps us a lot with this is contest QSOs have a very definite pattern, a flow. It's always somebody calls CQ. You send your call to them. They send your call in the exchange. You send back the exchange. They confirm and you're done. That's always going to happen. Well, if you think about the first time I ever listened to air traffic controllers, and it just sounded like gibberish going back and forth. Like, how can these guys understand what's going on? And after a while, you realize that it's always a call sign, and then it's some instruction, and then the other guy reads it back. And the thing is, they do it so much and that they just kind of, mumble it all together. But the deal is they know what they're listening for. They know that most of this stuff is just procedural. The call signs or the airline numbers are all procedural. You have to say that stuff to identify yourself. Or the real key thing is, what is the instruction and what's the read back? And contest QSOs are the same way. There's all this stuff going on, but in the end, I need your call sign. I need the exchange. That's all I need. Everything else that you say or that goes on the frequency or in between the spaces just doesn't matter. So you get very good at just kind of listening for the things that are important. And as you get this flow down, then it becomes much easier to switch your mind to like, oh, well, something is not happening that I expect on radio A. I'm going to go listen to radio B for a while, that kind of thing. The other part of this skills is the keyboarding skills of knowing your software. You have to get very good at knowing what are the steps to enter the call sign in the exchange. You want to get to the point where you can do it accurately, so you're not having to spend time to go back and fix things if you can. Most importantly, you need to know how to fix things. So invariably, someone will call you and you'll get their call wrong. Well, do you know the shortcut keys that will get you to where the problem is and fix it? Do you know what all the function keys in your software will do? Which ones send what messages, that kind of stuff. And you just practice this until it's automatic. And a good way to do that is with a program like Morse Runner, where you're just sitting there doing CW over and over. When I took the expedition trip with KL9A, I was impressed that Chris would spend 20 minutes every day on Morse Runner. He would sit down and just sit there, practice copying CW and working guys. And it was just a way to build proficiency, not so much about keyboarding, but just the whole combination. I've got to get stuff out of the noise, into my brain, and out my fingers, into the keyboard. And I was just really impressed by that level of practice and dedication to build up this skill set so he could do this 2B SIQ thing. Other ways that you can practice SO2R, and a good one is to operate a RTTY contest with your setup. RTTY is great because the computer does all the sending and receiving. And so you really can just focus on the flow of the QSOs and the switching back and forth and knowing which buttons to push when and so on. The transmissions tend to be pretty long. So it's a great practice ground for getting used to this. And the great thing is the CQ Worldwide RTTY contest at the end of September is the first one of the season. So it's often a really good practice to make sure, is the station all working? Do I have my mind around this? Do I know how to make the software do all the things that I needed to do? And that's all great. You can also practice on any contest with activity on 2 or more bands. Like somebody mentioned the salmon run before. That's a good one where you're being the chased station. So people are coming to find you. So that's a good one to try, calling CQ on one band while you listen on another. Maybe some contests like one I often think of from here is the Scandinavian activity contest, but for you it might be all Asian, where you've got 2 bands open at the same time. Just practice working guys doing search and pounce on two bands at the same time. And do it where you go through the band one time and then go back down to the bottom and come back through the band the second time, because they'll start building skills for remembering who you worked before, remembering the sounds of signals, remembering kind of what their exchange was. Did I work that guy before? The goal here is to try to get more proficient at not only tuning and acquiring signals, but also figuring out who they are as quickly as possible. And then W4AN used to talk about, when he was in the shack, he would just have both radios on with two different CW QSOs going on, and he would just listen to both of them. And again, I don't think he was copying both at the same time, but you get good at just switching back and forth and kind of following what's happening. Now, a lot of stuff I've talked about has to do with CW, and that's my mode of interest, but I like sideband too. Sideband's a little more difficult because you don't have the computer doing as much stuff. It's not as simple as I'm just going to type things in and let the computer say the call signs and so on. People are doing that now. And actually with some of this AI generated voice, there's guys that have it working now where they really can make phone be like CW, where they type in the call and it sounds very natural when it comes back to somebody. Doesn't sound like a computer talking at all. So a whole new world is coming. But sideband often has a lot more QRM, a little harder to hold a frequency and so on, but it's still, all the things that we've talked about of being able to use time more effectively are still true. And you have the voice keyer calling CQ for you. Well, while that time is going on, you can definitely listen around for other stations. For some reason, people don't send their call any more often on sideband than they do on CW, so you still have a lot of waiting time to see who it is you're trying to work. But again, on sideband, I tend to focus even more on just easy QSOs, not so much just trying to dig for multipliers, but just anybody I can work on the second radio fast. It's like a free contact. So I blasted through a lot of stuff here in a hurry, but hope give you some idea of kind of what's behind this whole SO2R thing. But my final advice here is the goal of this is to increase your efficiency. So that's why it helps to have these skills and this competence and understanding the flow, because you want to be able to use this second radio to make smart decisions about who to call or to when to change bands, that kind of thing. Be able to keep your run frequency all the time. So somebody listening to you from the outside should not be able to tell that you're working two radios. You should be that smooth. They may hear an occasional pause because you're busy sending to the other guy or repeating something to the other guy, but they should never really know that you're doing this at the top level. It's hard to get to be perfect, but that's the goal. And, just don't be an SO2R lid. Sometimes what'll happen is guys will be calling CQ and they'll have a frequency established, and they'll go off and work somebody on the second radio. And they'll get hung up there because it's a pile up or they're having to repeat something or whatever. And they're not there when somebody sends QRL or somebody else calls CQ, and they'll be gone for a while. And maybe you worked a couple of guys and then they come back and say, hey, this is my frequency. Well, sorry, you were gone. And so you always kind of have a little head in the back, timer in the back of your head going, okay, I can't stay away too long or somebody will come along and take my frequency. So that's, again, part of the practice and the skill building in this whole thing. Here's some resources. By the way, when we're done with this, I'll make a PDF of this presentation and send it. And you guys can share it or post it however you want. But I did a series of SO2R videos where you can actually hear it, where I work people on two radios, and there's a little bit of explanation of how it works and how it sounds. This presentation, CTU presentation by N2NT, really gets into a lot of the more detailed, advanced kind of things than what we've talked about here. But I hope that gives you some insight into all this.